I would like to give you some general tips regarding starting a dealership. Many of you may be starting a dealership, or perhaps you're renewing your dealer's license. And these are some great tips concerning the legal operation of any dealership according to the United States Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So in this section, we're going to cover creating employee policies, disability accommodations, religious accommodations, criminal records, responding to an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission charge of discrimination, preventing retaliation, performance evaluations, disciplining or firing employees, setting pay, training employees, and training sales managers. First, let's talk about creating employee policies. Dealerships may be able to prevent and correct discrimination without the use of a formal written employee policy. For example, you may inform employees that discrimination is prohibited and encourage employees to report discrimination to you directly. Even so, you may decide to develop written policies. Developing and distributing clear employee policies and updating those policies as needed and consistently enforcing those policies may help employees understand and comply with your rules and your expectations as the dealership owner. It'll also help prevent problems that may result in discrimination complaints and possibly limit your liability should a complaint arise. Even if you decide not to have written policies, the following information may be helpful when developing your dealership workplace rules and expectations. You're going to need to decide what type of policy that you're creating. Maybe you're creating a general non-discrimination policy or harassment policy, or maybe a reasonable accommodation policy, a leave policy. We're going to talk about these. A general discrimination policy states that discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, age, or genetic information, and that's going to include family medical history, that it is illegal and will not be tolerated. You'll need to provide definitions and examples of prohibited conduct when it's needed. You'll need to state that you'll provide reasonable accommodations. And reasonable accommodations are changes to the way things are normally done at work. And this needs to be done for applicants and employees who need them for medical or religious reasons that are required by law. Explain how employees can report discrimination. If possible, designate more than one person to receive and respond to discrimination complaints or questions. Consider permitting employees to report discrimination to any manager. State that employees will not be punished for reporting discrimination. That's very, very important. You need to let your employees know they'll never be punished for reporting discrimination or participating in a discrimination investigation or lawsuit that opposes discrimination. You'll need to state that you will protect the confidentiality of employees who report discrimination or participate in these discrimination investigations. You'll also need to require sales managers and other employees with human resources responsibilities to respond appropriately to discrimination or to report it to individuals who are authorized to respond. You'll need to provide for prompt, thorough, and impartial investigation of complaints if you ever do have complaints. You'll need to also provide for prompt and effective corrective and preventive action when needed as well. You should definitely consider requiring that employees who file internal complaints be notified about the status of their complaint, the results of the investigation, and also let your employees know of any type of corrective or preventive action that has been taken. Your policies also need to describe the consequences of violating the non-discrimination policy. A harassment policy. You'll need to state that harassment based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, or age is illegal and will not be tolerated as well. And you'll need to provide definitions of examples of prohibited conduct as needed as well. You'll also need to let your employees know how to report harassment. And so I strongly encourage you, if possible, designate at least one person outside an employee's chain of command who can also receive harassment complaints. So maybe a salesperson works directly under a sales manager, and maybe that's the main person that you have them report harassment to. But if possible, you should designate at least one person outside that employee's chain, just in case maybe the sales manager was involved in that harassment. Well, they certainly don't want to report that harassment directly to that person. So you might have, say, for example, a human resource assistant or something like that. Consider permitting employees to report harassment to any manager in your dealership or anybody of a leadership capacity, such as you, maybe an owner or a general manager, in addition to the sales managers. State that you will protect the confidentiality of employees who report harassment or participate in harassment investigations to the greatest possible extent. You'll definitely need to state that employees will not be punished for reporting harassment or participating in a harassment lawsuit. So keep that in mind. You'll definitely need to require sales managers and other employees with human resources responsibilities to respond appropriately to harassment or to report it to the proper individuals when required. You'll need to provide for prompt, thorough, and impartial investigation of any type of harassment claims, and consider requiring that employees who file internal complaints be notified always about the status of their complaints. And you always, a very important part of any policy is to definitely clearly describe the consequences of violating those policies. Another type of policy that you might consider creating is called a reasonable accommodation policy. And this specifies that your dealership will provide reasonable accommodations, and those are changes to the way that things are normally done, to applicants and employees who need them for medical or religious reasons. It might be helpful to provide examples of the disability accommodations or religious accommodations. And you'll need to identify and provide contact information for those individuals as well. So, there are certain circumstances where, you may have a person, an employee, or even an applicant request additional medical or religious information. You might have to have them show documentation for medical conditions or something like that. So that's something that's going to definitely help you out. Always encourage applicants and employees to, respond to any needs promptly. Make them aware that you're ready to accommodate them, and also require sales managers to keep any medical information obviously confidential, okay? And you maybe want to have a separate medical file that only you or maybe an owner has access to. You obviously don't want other persons in the dealership to have access to any type of other employee or applicant medical records. Also, consider requiring the decisions to either deny accommodation request or to provide accommodation requests be explained to the applicant or the employee. And, this may help clearly prevent misunderstandings and complaints from that job applicant or from that employee. Explain how employees can report discrimination related to reasonable accommodations, such as, if you denied a reasonable accommodation request, you need to let them know how they can respond to that. Describe the consequences of violating the reasonable accommodation policy as well. Another type of very important policy that you might develop is called a leave policy. And by the way, there are examples of these all over the internet. So if you, say, for example, go to your favorite search engine and type in sample leave policy, you'll see some PDFs that you can download and alter, as long as they're not copyrighted, obviously. But there are companies out there, government agencies, that give you sample leave policies, accommodation policies, harassment policies, and general non-discrimination policies that you can just basically type your dealership name in. But just make sure if you're using any of those downloadable policies that they are not copyright protected. Let's talk about a leave policy. If you have a leave policy, you'll need to explain the circumstances under which leave is available. You'll need to let employees and applicants know the eligibility requirements for the leave and also the procedures for requesting leave and the respective responsibilities of the dealership and the employee during and after that leave period. You'll need to clarify that you will provide leave to employees who need it for medical or religious reasons. You may be required to provide medical or religious leave even if you do not have a leave policy. I want to repeat that. You may be required under law to provide medical or religious leave even if you do not have a leave policy. And also, even if the employee has not earned enough leave, they couldn't be eligible for leave, or if the employee has exhausted their leave, they still may be eligible for leave as well. You are required to provide employees with leave for medical reasons related to disability. So say, for example, for an employee to attend a doctor's appointment or maybe recovering from surgery, for example, unless it would be significantly difficult or expensive for your dealership. And that's normally fairly hard to prove, okay? You are required to provide employees with leave for religious reasons. I want to repeat that again. You're required to provide employees with leave for religious reasons. So to attend a religious service or to observe a religious holiday, for example, unless it's going to require more than minimal cost or a burden for your business. And once again, that can be very hard to prove. So definitely be aware that the law does require you provide employees with leave for religious reasons. Consider recommending that a sales manager meet with the employee requesting the leave and the employee's manager, if necessary, to clarify the leave request or to solicit other relevant information. So sometimes you might have, say, for example, either a human resource manager or maybe a sales manager that sometimes does act as an intermediary between you and the employees, because there could be days, maybe you're at an auction and you've got a sales manager running things for you. Well, you definitely need to make sure that they are aware of these laws. But, it may be helpful to discuss the employee's current workload and even a temporary transfer of their responsibilities if possible. And always make sure that your sales managers, or maybe you got a general manager, or even if you're large enough to have a human resource director, make sure that they respond to leave requests in a very prompt manner. If a prompt response is not possible, consider periodically updating the employee on the status of their requests. To prevent misunderstandings, consider recommending that decisions to modify or deny leave requests be explained to the employee. Require that sales managers keep genetic information or medical information received as a result of that leave request confidential. Okay, so there could even be somebody in your dealership that, they don't want the other employees to know their religious beliefs, but they want to take a day off for a religious belief. You have to make sure that you, general managers, and all leadership persons in your dealership keep all that information confidential. And these tips are based on federal employment discrimination law. So, those are some of the types of employment policies that you can create for your dealership. But you need to also be aware of what's called a disability accommodation. You may need to provide accommodations. And as I said, that's changing the way things are normally done at your dealership to any applicant or employee with a disability. You'll need to learn about who the law protects, how to recognize and respond to disability accommodation requests, and also who you can contact for assistance. An applicant or an employee with a disability may need a reasonable accommodation to allow them to apply for their job or perform the job or enjoy the same benefits as all of your other employees. For example, an applicant who uses a wheelchair may ask that the interview be scheduled in an accessible location, or an employee with diabetes may request an exception to the no food or drinks policy in the workplace if you have one of those. So you might have to adjust those rules so they can eat or drink when necessary to adjust their insulin level. Very important to be aware of that. You'll need to understand who the law protects. The law protects applicants and employees with disabilities. Now, I want to remind you, applicants and employees. So it protects someone who's possibly applying for a job, but also protects your current employees as well. This includes people who have disabilities that do not affect them all the time, such as epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. These are disabilities that you need to be aware of. People who have disabilities and people who have had disabilities in the past may be entitled to reasonable accommodations if needed. Recognize requests for disability accommodation. An applicant or employee may indicate they need an adjustment or change in their application process or a change at work for reasons related to their conditions. And definitely consider those requests. Don't automatically refuse an accommodation request or have an inflexible policy that doesn't allow for exceptions. You'll need to review each request individually. There's no one-size-fits-all accommodation. Accommodations may be based on the employee's medical condition, medical treatment, or their job duties. Discuss the request with the applicant or employee if needed. Ask for additional information if needed to help you determine what types of accommodations might be effective for both that individual and your dealership. For example, if an employee who is partially blind requests special computer software to complete a credit application, you might want to discuss what types of software would best meet their needs, because they're probably going to be more aware of that software than you are, and they can definitely be an asset when you're searching for software that they could possibly use. Also consider alternative accommodations. If it's not possible to provide the requested accommodation, determine whether the accommodations would be effective for the applicant or the employee for your dealership. Consider all additional requests. An employee may need another accommodation or a different accommodation later due to changes in their job responsibilities, or maybe a change in their medical condition or their medical treatment. Always, please do keep that in mind. You'll need to provide an effective accommodation unless doing so requires significant difficulty or expense or changes the fundamental job duties. Just don't automatically assume that you can't afford to provide accommodations. Many accommodations are really not expensive at all. And, some of those accommodations are actually free. Also, you may be eligible for tax credits, such as a small business tax credit or other funding, such as a vocational rehabilitational funding as well. So please keep that in mind. Disability accommodations are extremely important, as are religious accommodations. You may need to provide accommodations to allow applicants and employees to practice or observe their religion. For example, you might have an applicant ask you to reschedule an interview that is on a religious holiday, or you might have an employee that may request an exception to the no hats rule so they can wear a religious head covering. You'll need to understand who the law protects. The law protects people who have sincere religious, ethical, or moral beliefs. This includes people who belong to traditional or organized religions, or other religions such as Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Sikhism, as well as people who have newer or less common religious beliefs, and atheists. So definitely consider the request. Don't automatically don't automatically refuse an accommodation or have an inflexible policy that does not allow for exceptions. That's a big no-no, okay? Review each request individually and avoid assumptions about religious beliefs or practices or appropriate actions. You definitely want to avoid all assumptions, regarding that person's religious belief or their religious practices. So always, with all policies, discuss the request with the applicant or employee if you need, and you need to ensure that you understand the employee's religious needs and let them know the available accommodation options at your dealership. For example, if an employee requests a schedule change so they can attend a religious service, you may want to discuss when the services take place and the conflicts that are posed by the employee's current schedule so you can determine whether a schedule adjustment is going to be possible. You'll need to do your best to provide an effective accommodation unless doing so requires more than a minimal cost based on your resources and the operation of your dealership. Be receptive to all additional accommodation requests. Please keep that in mind. In general, you are required to provide reasonable accommodations to applicants who need them for medical or religious reasons. However, you're not required to provide a disability accommodation that requires incurring significant expense or difficulty for your dealership or changing the fundamental job duties, okay? Or it does not also require lowering performance standards or tolerating misconduct, okay? You're not required to provide a religious accommodation that would pose more than a minimal cost or a burden. But to ensure that accommodation requests are handled properly and to prevent complaints, consider developing a process to handle accommodation requests that encourage discussions when employees need to let you know what is needed. Always ensure your leadership personnel know how to identify and respond to all accommodation requests, especially the religious accommodation requests, and determine whether or not you can provide those accommodations. I also want you to be aware there is a possibility that you could receive an equal employment opportunity commission charge, okay? So if you ever receive an equal employment opportunity commission charge, here's some advice. And the first thing you would have to do, and this would be just in case you were not providing the proper accommodations, okay? So you need to review that charge carefully. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, well, sometimes we saw that the EEOC this charge informs you that a complaint, a charge of discrimination or something similar has been filed against your dealership. It does not mean that you have violated the laws that the EEOC enforces. A charge is a complaint of discrimination. It's not a determination that discrimination has occurred. So you need to follow the directions on the EEOC charge notice. The notice may ask you to provide a response to the charge, and that can be called your position statement. This is your opportunity to explain why the claims in the charge are incorrect or are not illegal. You are not required to hire a lawyer to help you draft a position statement or otherwise respond to a charge of discrimination. However, at any point in the EEOC charge process, you may do so if you want to. And I always encourage legal advice in this industry. You'll never go wrong by seeking legal advice, no matter what it regards the dealership operations. Consider EEOC mediation to resolve the charge quickly and confidentially at no cost. So the EEOC will actually get involved in the mediation between you and, say, for example, a job applicant or an employee that has made an EEOC charge. So they do actually offer confidential and free mediation services between you and the employee or possible job applicant. You'll also need to respond for requests for additional information from the EEOC, even if you believe that charge is frivolous. The EEOC investigator may request documents, interviews, a conference, or possibly an on-dealership inspection. The information you provide may cause the EEOC to dismiss that charge entirely. So do please keep that in mind. If you need additional time to respond, or if you have questions or concerns about the type or amount of information that the EEOC has requested, contact that investigator assigned to the charge. You're going to find that they're very receptive, because a lot of times investigators will never hear from the business that's had the EEOC charge. They'll send them a notification, and if you don't respond, well, that's going to be that's going to be good for the other side. Okay, that's going to be good for the job applicant or the employee. So always respond to that investigator, and you can actually contact them directly with any questions, because you will have an investigator that is charged to an EEOC discrimination complaint against your dealership if this ever does happen to you. The EEOC may grant you an extension or modify the information request depending on the circumstances. You've got to protect employees from retaliation. And I'm going to say that several times here. You must protect employees from retaliation, and to ensure that the employee is not punished for filing that charge, and ensure that employees are not punished for participating in any investigation. Retaliation is illegal, even if the EEOC concludes that the charge of discrimination doesn't have any merit. Retaliation is illegal. You'll always need to retain all relevant documents. As I've said several times throughout the course, you're never going to have too much paperwork, so you always want to, retain all documents. If you're not sure whether a document is relevant, then ask your investigator. You can contact the EEOC investigator assigned to you if you have any questions whatsoever. They're going to be there for you. They're going to be very friendly and helpful for you because you're not guilty. You've just been charged, and they will definitely treat you in that manner. As I just mentioned, you must always prevent retaliation. So retaliation occurs when employers treat applicants or employees, or maybe former employees, or a person that was closely associated with these individuals less favorably for reporting discrimination or participating in a discrimination investigation or a lawsuit. So for example, maybe they had to serve as a witness, or, if they were in the opposing discrimination, for example, maybe they have, threatened to file a charge or complaint of discrimination. You cannot retaliate. And for example, it is illegal to fire an employee because they filed a charge of discrimination with the EEOC. I want to repeat that very important statement as well. It is illegal to fire an employee because they filed a charge of discrimination with the EEOC. This is true even if the EEOC concludes that the charge of discrimination does not have merit. So do please keep that in mind. Retaliation is not only illegal, it's also bad for business. It is in your best interest for employees to feel comfortable responding and reporting to discrimination, so you can investigate and address any conduct that violates the law or your dealership policies. So remember to help prevent retaliation, inform employees that retaliation is prohibited. Assure employees that they will not be punished for taking actions that are protected by the law. Respond to discrimination questions, concerns, and complaints promptly and very effectively. Ensure that sales managers understand the responsibility to stop, address, and prevent retaliation, and hold employees accountable for complying with and enforcing your discrimination rules and policies. Performance evaluations. Despite your best efforts to implement a fair evaluation system and ensure that sales managers apply performance standards consistently, employees may complain that their evaluations were unfair or are inaccurate for discriminatory reasons. For example, an employee may claim that they were given an unwarranted negative performance evaluation because they complained that they were paid less than a male colleague who performed the same work. Conducting a prompt, thorough, and impartial investigation of internal discrimination complaints about performance evaluations and taking appropriate corrective measures when necessary may resolve problems and hopefully will prevent them from ever happening again. Here's some tips that might be helpful in this process. Ask the employee to specifically identify their concerns with that evaluation. For example, do they object to the overall rating, to the particular statements in the evaluation, or to the actions that resulted from the rating? For example, maybe a lower pay raise than expected, or possibly a demotion, or maybe even a transfer of job responsibilities. Ask the employee. Ask the employee why they believe the evaluation was discriminatory. Meet with the employee's manager and other individuals involved in the evaluation decision, if necessary, to discuss the employee's concerns. Review relevant material. For example, if the evaluation was based in part on a decrease in sales or maybe a decrease in customer satisfaction, review sales data or customer surveys to determine if they are consistent with that evaluation. If appropriate, review other employee evaluations to determine whether there's any evidence of discrimination. For example, review the evaluation of members of the employee's work group, their sales team. You might have sales teams. If employees who have filed complaints generally receive lower evaluations, determine whether those evaluations are justified. This may help you determine whether the manager or the sales manager or even a human resource assistant has consistently applied performance standards and policies to all employees of your dealership. If you find evidence of discrimination, ensure that this discrimination stops immediately. You'll need to correct any effects of that discrimination and prevent it from ever happening again. For example, if you determine that an employee received a lower performance evaluation than they deserve because they complained about pay discrimination, retract that evaluation. Issue a new evaluation that is consistent with your performance standards and your policies, and provide the employee any pay, seniority, or other benefits that they would have received if they had been treated properly. You need to correct these measures. Consider whether to discipline any sales manager involved in a discriminatory performance evaluation. If you determine that an evaluation was warranted, inform the employee immediately. It may be helpful to explain that the steps you took to investigate the complaint and the results of your investigation and the basis for your decision. So one of the best pieces of advice here is to just constantly stay in contact, with any employee that has any, discrimination complaints or evaluation complaints or pay complaints and things like that. Always document the results of the investigation and always document any corrective or preventive actions that have been taken. Paperwork. Document. You will never, ever have too much paperwork in this business. Here's something that's a little sensitive. It's, disciplining or firing employees. Unfortunately, it may be necessary for you to discipline or even terminate an employee. And, there are many reasons why this action may be justifiable. Even so, it is possible that taking disciplinary action can result in a discrimination charge or complaint. So here's some tips on how to handle internal discrimination complaints. Despite your very best efforts to implement a fair disciplinary policy and ensure that sales managers apply the policy consistently, employees may complain that they were treated unfairly for discriminatory reasons. For example, an employee may complain that they were punished more severely than other employees who broke similar roles because of their race. Conducting a prompt or thorough and impartial investigation of any internal discrimination complaints about disciplinary action and taking appropriate corrective measures when needed is absolutely prevented from keeping them from happening. It's absolutely imperative from keeping them from happening again. So here's some tips that might be helpful. Ask the employee to explain why they believe they were treated differently than other employees, and identify the other employees who believes that they were treated more favorably. Meet with the managers involved in those disciplinary decisions and ask them to explain the disciplinary actions that were imposed on an employee or others who committed similar infractions, okay? You'll need to explain the reasons for these actions, including why any employees may have been treated differently. Determine whether the disciplinary policy was consistently applied. That's why another reason, you want to make sure you have these policies in writing. If employees who committed similar infractions were not punished or were punished less severely, determine if that response was justified. For example, was the infraction a repeat offense for an employee who complained about discrimination and a first offense for the employee who were treated more favorably? You definitely need to be aware of this. Were the infractions similar? For example, did the employee who reported discrimination use vulgar language in front of other customers while the other employees used vulgar language only in front of coworkers? Think about that. Were the other circumstances that were merited to treating employees differently? If you find evidence of discrimination, ensure this discrimination stops immediately. If you do determine an employee was punished more severely than other employees because of their race, you will need to amend any relevant documents to reflect the appropriate discipline action there. This cannot be tolerated under any circumstances whatsoever, okay? And if that did happen, you would need to provide the employee any pay, seniority, or other benefits they would have received if they had been treated properly after that case. Consider whether to discipline any sales managers involved in disciplinary action as well. So you need to ensure that anybody in a leadership capacity are aware not only of how to prevent harassment, but what to do if harassment is occurred or reported to them as well. Harassment cannot be tolerated in any dealership. If you do determine that the punishment was warranted, then you would need the employee. And it might be helpful to explain the steps you took to investigate that complaint. Consider documenting the results of any investigation and always take corrective action when needed. You'll also need to set employee pay properly. Determining how much to pay employees can be very complex, okay? And, most states have different types of minimum wage laws. You may consider a number of factors, but including your employee's qualification, your business's current and anticipated revenue, and the economic climate. You may also consider your legal responsibilities. Here's some tips ensuring that you or sales managers involved in pay decisions understand their responsibilities. This may help prevent pay discrimination. Ensure that all persons in a leadership capacity in your dealership who are involved in pay decisions understand their responsibilities relating to making pay decisions, documenting those decisions, and retaining relevant records. Maybe you're going to be the principal owner that's completely running the dealership, but even if you have one, say for example, a senior sales associate that is basically responsible, you need to make sure that they're aware of everything, even if they have a decision in the pay making standards of your dealership. Determine the criteria that we'll use to make compensation decisions, and you'll need to apply that criteria consistently. Avoid basing pay solely on factors that may be discriminatory, such as prior salary. Instead, independently evaluate an individual's job-related qualifications, such as a salesperson. Ensure the decisions regarding pay are never based on race, color, religion, sex, and that includes pregnancy, sexual orientation, or gender identity. Make sure you don't base it on national origin or disability or age, and that's going to be 40 or older, or once again, genetic information, as I stated earlier, which includes family medical history. Providing equal pay to male and female employees who share the same work is definitely needed unless you can justify a pay difference under the law, which is very, very difficult to do. Consider documenting decisions that affect pay. Get everything in writing. This includes decisions about starting pay, decisions about bonuses, raises, or other pay adjustments, and other decisions that may affect pay, such as an employee's performance evaluation. This may help to ensure that decisions are made consistently. It may also help you to recall the reasons for a particular pay decision if a discrimination charge or complaint is ever filed with the EEOC. You also want to retain any payroll records for at least 3 years. Retain any records such as wage rates, performance evaluations, seniority and merit system information that may explain the difference between the pay differences between male and female employees for at least 2 to 3 years. So keep that in mind. It's great to have something in writing that shows step by step, when an employee gets raises, such as maybe you've got a starting pay for them, and once they've sold a certain amount of vehicles, then they can get it bumped up. or maybe have that reevaluated every 6 months, so that can definitely be an incentive, not only for the employee to help sell more vehicles for you, but it can hopefully prevent harassment and any type of complaints to the EEOC that you were not paying someone correctly. So make sure you have all your pay policies in writing. This will be very, very advantageous to your dealership. Training employees. Ensuring that employees understand your discrimination rules and policies may help prevent problems from arising. Check out these tips. Okay, here, ensuring that employees understand your discrimination rules and policies can help prevent problems from arising. Always in your training, state that discrimination based on race, color, religion, sexual orientation, national origin, disability, age, or genetic information is illegal and will not be tolerated. You have to let your employees know about this. Provide definitions and examples of those conducts when needed. You'll need to ensure that employees understand their rights and responsibilities at work. I know whether you're getting your dealership license for the very first time, or maybe you've been a dealer for several years, maybe you're just getting ready to hire employees for the very first time. It's very, very important that you ensure employees understand their rights and their responsibilities. You'll need to describe your dealership policies regarding discrimination, harassment, and reasonable accommodation, as we discussed earlier. If the policies are written, which I strongly encourage you to get them in writing, then distribute them and explain where employees can find copies, okay? Explain any charges made to the policies explain any changes made to the policy since the prior training. Okay, so when you're having training scenarios, you want to let the employees know any changes that have made since the previous policies they were trained on. Describe your business's policies and procedures regarding discrimination questions or complaints. You definitely need to know, your employees need to know how they can report discrimination. Okay, this is a very important tool in preventing discrimination. Identify what employees they should contact to ask questions or file a complaint. They need to know who they can go to directly and hopefully have a secondary person as well. Describe the information that you may request from employees who file complaints. For example, you might ask employees to describe the discrimination, including approximate dates, identify potential witnesses, or provide other relevant information or material in your discrimination policies. Explain how your dealership investigates and resolves discrimination complaints. Assure employees that they will never be punished for reporting discrimination or participating in a discrimination investigation or lawsuit or opposing discrimination. Assure employees that you will protect their confidentiality when reporting discrimination, and always let your employees know in training that the consequence of violating your business's non-discrimination policy. So you clearly have to have everything in writing and explain the consequences of violating your dealership's non-discrimination policies. That's a very, very important component of any discrimination policy. Now, training sales managers is a little bit different than training the actual employee, because sales managers would have a little bit more of a role in the discrimination reporting process. So you'll need to ensure that sales managers, or even a general manager, or maybe a human resource director that you might have, that they understand and consistently enforce your discrimination rules and policies. And this will allow sales managers to quickly identify and resolve potential problems early before they arise to the level of unlawful discrimination. Stay in contact with all employees at all times. Yeah, and hopefully this never happens, but hopefully there's never, say for example, a salesperson that reported a discrimination complaint to a sales manager, and that sales manager never passed that on to you. Well, that's going to be a big problem. So you need to let your sales managers or any person in a leadership capacity know that they've got to report the information to you, because ultimately the owner of the dealership or a partner or officer of the dealership can be responsible for a lack of responding to these complaints. Let the sales managers or any person in a leadership capacity know that discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, genetic information, disabilities, national origins, or age is illegal and will not be tolerated. And you'll also need to let them know the specific policies regarding discrimination and accommodation as well. So if they are written, make sure that you distribute these to sales managers in addition to any other regular policies that you might distribute to every employee of your dealership. And, if you do have any specific training session, make sure and explain any training that has been changed since a prior training. Ensure that sales managers or persons of a leadership capacity know their responsibilities, including, non-discrimination. They need to ensure that applicants and employees are never discriminated against. They need to know about reasonable accommodations. So your sales managers need to know how to respond to requests for reasonable accommodations and those complaints. So, making sure that they let you know about this is certainly a very important component of your dealership. Describe your business policies to them and let them know and identify the individuals that are going to be responsible for receiving. So you could even have a sales manager. They need to know who they can report to promptly as well. So instruct those sales managers to respond appropriately to any discrimination or reports, and make sure that they pass that along to the authorized individual. Ensure that relevant sales managers understand how to investigate discrimination, stop harassment, and correct discrimination, and explain the consequences to that sales manager of not reporting those policies directly to you. So the punishments definitely need to be part of the policy. So always remember, you're going to have some training for the general employee, but you'll have additional training for anybody in a leadership capacity, such as a sales manager, that might be the person that is the first line of reporting for discrimination in the dealership. Hey, if you have any questions on how to prevent harassment or prevent discrimination, or even to create employment policies, you can contact the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, 131 M Street NE, that's Northeast, Washington, D.C., 20507. Here's their number. They're a great resource for any dealership that has employees, 202-663-4900. Once again, that's 202-663-4900. You can also shoot them an email to info@eeoc.gov. And their website is going to be that secure website, https://eeoc.gov. They're going to be a great resource for you. And as a reminder, like I said, they do actually have sample policies for you on their website. So this is definitely a great thing for you when you are hiring employees at your dealership.